Does your financial advisor take the time to really listen to you? Is your financial strategy personalized to you and your family? Will your financial advisor be there as your life and financial situation change? Hi, I'm Jerry Mangona, your Edward Jones financial advisor. I live here in Corktown, just a few blocks from the Daily Detroit studios, and when we work together, we'll focus on what's important to you. We'll use an established process to create a personalized financial strategy backed by the advice, tools, and resources to help you reach your goals. And we'll partner together to help your strategy stay on track. Contact me toll-free today at 866-975-8655. Again, that's 866-975-8655. Edward Jones, member SIPC.
Hello, friends. How are you doing on this Tuesday, November 8th, Election Day in the United States? I'm Jer Stays, and it is good to see you. Today's episode is going to focus on a question that a lot of listeners have sent in, and various questions, frankly, about gas prices. What's behind them? What powers the rises and falls? What's ahead for the future? You know, this is the Motor City, and despite the talk of transit and all the things that we will and do dive into on this podcast, we are still very dependent on our vehicles. So gas prices, they frankly matter to a lot of people. So Patrick Haan from GasBuddy will join me. I've put together a series of questions, should be very interesting. And then I'll send you out the door with some things to know around town. All right, let's get started.
Someday we'll make it on by. Other days we only can try. Either way, no matter what people say, either way, we're gonna get someday.
Joining me virtually is the head of petroleum analysis for GasBuddy, Patrick Haan. Welcome to Daily Detroit.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to talk with you. You know, over the last few months, listeners, and frankly last year, listeners have had so many concerns and questions about gas prices. And I feel like, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the gas price, all that stuff conversation. And I feel like it's important to kind of look at things with how things actually work as opposed to looking at them through a partisan lens.
Yeah, so much has been made of the political climate, and a lot of people point to the pump and point fingers. Those fingers can go either way, right? There's politicians engaging on whether prices are up or down, or gas tax holidays here or there, or oil drilling there and here. And there's just a lot of noise when it comes to the actual truth behind gas price movements.
When I drive a few miles, whether it's from the city to the suburbs or even within a suburb or within the city, I can see vastly different gas prices nowadays. And it feels like it wasn't that way always before, or maybe I didn't notice it because gas prices weren't as expensive. What's kind of behind that?
Well, there's been an incredible amount of volatility this year in the wholesale price of gasoline. It's because the situation is very tight. We've lost about 1 million barrels a day of refining capacity, and it's been less about really the price of oil, which, by the way, has also been volatile, and more about being able to supply that oil and turn it into something meaningful like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. And that has led to an incredible variety in prices. The volatility is just off the charts. And there was a day last week where the wholesale price of gasoline, I think, jumped 50 cents a gallon in one day. That contributed to a big surge that we saw last week in prices. And now the wholesale price is plummeting again. So a lot of that was attributed to refinery maintenance that has been ongoing. That's led to very tight gasoline supply. And then very quickly, apparently, we went the other way. Just kind of highlighting the year it's been. There's very little margin for error. And when things go bad this year, it's gone a lot worse than what we've seen in the past years. And a lot of it is still because of imbalances brought on by COVID. But also, there's a lot to be said about Russia's war in Ukraine. And I know a lot of Americans say, hey, it's 8 months ago, and how's that impacting us? But Russia is a major supplier of not only oil, but natural gas. So that brings with it a lot of volatility. When there are daily changes and when there are sanctions on Russia to block their oil, there's a lot that can change.
So there's a number of listeners who've asked, the United States produces a lot of fuel. Why is it that we are dependent on a global market? How does that interface?
The U.S. buys oil from other countries. We export oil as well. And it's a global system. You can't just fence the U.S. off. You can't just fence one country off. Now, there are countries that subsidize their fuel prices, but every country pays the market price for oil. That is Saudi Arabia, right? They sell oil abroad for right now, it's about $90 a barrel. The government, though, is paying the market price and they basically subsidize it for their citizens. So every country, whether a buyer or seller, agrees that this market price based on suppliers, based on buyers and sellers, that is the system that determines price. And the U.S. can't really fence itself off from that. If there was somehow legislation to try and do it, there'd be a lot of bad things that would happen down the road. It would basically disincentivize oil companies to produce as much here. So there would be a lot of negative effects. But just like the housing market, right? You go state to state, I can buy and sell a home in any state. That's kind of how the global system works. Instead of states, think countries that buy and sell oil.
You mentioned a lot of volatility. There are a lot of things happening. What are the key things? You mentioned the war in Ukraine, which is crucial. You mentioned COVID, which is frankly still impacting a lot of businesses. I was just doing an interview earlier today with somebody who said they're still having staffing issues due to COVID. It's not because people are dying or such, but they're still getting sick. And like those are the kinds of things that I think that in our news cycle, we see it and it goes by and we think it's a long time ago. But, 3/4 of the word news is new. And so often news moves on from stuff when it's not new.
Well, exactly right. Now, personally, I feel like COVID's not a big deal anymore, right? We can fly anywhere. We can travel abroad. I mean, other countries have opened up. So it feels like we've moved on from the immediate factors. But in the background, there was a tremendous and abrupt change that we all made during COVID. And that had a major impact on refineries, on the oil sector, just like airlines, right? They can't have enough planes and pilots and flight attendants now because they basically shut everything down. Now, airlines are rebounding pretty well, but the oil industry, right? Oil went negative. People weren't driving. Gasoline demand plummeted 60% as a business. You don't have this rainy day slosh fund to save your business from, something with such a significant impact like COVID. So oil producers had to shut down, drillers shut down, refineries slashed output. Some refineries shut down completely. And it's because of the permanent decisions businesses made. Some refineries shut down because of COVID. It's now the impacts, the loss of that refining capacity from COVID that's now biting us and causing prices to go up because we just don't have as much refining capacity as we did. And that is now the choke point, or at least one of the many choke points.
So it's a question of supply and demand.
It always is. Gas prices, oil prices are always moving. There's many factors that feed into that. It's, when we hear of gas tax holidays that have occurred in some other states, some people don't wake up tomorrow and see the decrease at the pump or the increase, the corresponding increase or decrease, because there's so many factors that don't make that a direct comparison. I mean, oil prices are moving on a daily, hourly, minute basis every day of the week. And, the situation, the global balance of supply and demand is changing minute by minute. Some of it's based on perception, but if China, for example, if they were to end their very, very tough COVID policies, if they reopened officially and they said, we're going to change strategies, oil prices would likely jump significantly in a moment's notice because that news would send demand or likely would imply demand is going to go up, right, if China reopens its economy. So anything like that it can affect supply and demand can abruptly change prices. And because there's little breathing room, when those stories do happen, they can have more effect than they would have in the past.
I feel like I know the answer to this one, but I feel like I also have to ask it. How much impact does the president of the United States have on gas prices? Whoever it is, whatever party.
In the very short term, not much. In the longer term, when those decisions, whether they're pro or con, as those decisions would have a greater impact over time, that's where the president has a little bit more input. Now, oil companies are going to do what they want. They're not at the behest of the president to produce or to shut down. Now, the president can kind of get in the way, if you will. In the case of the Keystone, right, he shut down a pipeline, but that pipeline wasn't so relevant anyway from an energy perspective. But the president's inputs can have, like I said, in the short term, minor impact. Things like waiving gasoline requirements, can have an impact. The amount of drilling permits can have a longer term impact, right? Because it takes years for oil companies to get a permit, to drill it, to find a well that has enough oil to bring it to market. Then the infrastructure has to follow. So generally speaking, where many Americans have said, oh, President Biden has shut down the Keystone. Well, again, that pipeline wasn't really necessary. It wasn't critical. It wasn't like you're taking a pipeline that was already in commission out of service. That would have had a far greater impact. But in the years ahead, if the U.S. and Canada continue to increase production, well, then in the future, you can say, well, we don't have this pipeline. We can't grow as much as we should have because there's not as much infrastructure. So it takes a very long time for the president's policies, whether Republican or Democrat, to have, generally speaking, a major impact. Now, President Biden said tomorrow, changed all his stances and he's going to allow drilling here and there. That may not have an immediate impact, but it would be like a psychological boost to oil companies. It would give them a clear signal, a path that the president's not going to get in the way. So that might incentivize oil companies to spend a little bit more. But again, the impacts, I think, are vastly overstated. Politicians like to say, oh, he's got all the control. But no, he really doesn't. There's high prices for gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel in the U.S. That exists in every country. It's not just the U.S., it's Canada, it's Asia, it's Africa. Anywhere you go, you're going to see the high price of fuel. So a U.S. president has very, very little control over the price of a global commodity.
And when you talk about that time horizon, are you saying months, years? Because when people say, the short-term impact, in your mind is short-term like weeks and long-term like, say, 2 or 3 years, or how does that kind of work for you?
Again, it really depends on what the president's policy is. I'll give you an example, right? Is that this summer, there was talk about the president waiving the gasoline requirements. That could have a very quick effect because it's an immediate impact on the type of gasoline that can be used. And actually, I think some states in the Great Lakes, Michigan included, Governor Whitmer waived requirements for gasoline in late August because of a refinery outage. That can have a very quick impact because quickly, instead of having to produce a more stringent blend of gasoline, refiners within a week can start producing something else. They can produce a type of fuel that's not as stringent very easily. But the bigger impacts, right, that have a longer term impact take years to manifest. For example, if the president stops issuing permits or if he legislates limitations in oil or disincentivizes somehow through executive action like the Keystone, that really takes years to manifest where we can say, okay, the prime reason oil is this is because the president did this 5 years ago. I mean, keep in mind, refineries and oil producing wells take years to get online, like I said. So, if the president were to block a refinery, well, that refinery may not have been built for 7 years if it would have gone ahead in the first place. So a lot of the clout that the president has on oil prices would take a long time to manifest. There are generally small things he can do in the very short term, but like I said, very small. And that's why this big jump in oil, I think, is overstated. The blame on the president would be down the road. Right now, we're still dealing with the imbalances from COVID. I think primarily is that combined with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because those impacts were very quick. Those sanctions on Russia were immediate. Refinery shutting down during COVID were immediate. Now we're paying the price for that.
So is there anything that an average consumer can do to help with gas prices? Are there things that average people, because they look at the pump and they kind of feel powerless. I think that's part of the reason why people look at politicians, because they don't feel like they can do anything.
Individually, no. Individually, you can't do a whole lot. But collectively, if Americans did things like just driving a little bit more efficiently, we could reduce our gasoline demand significantly. And the prime example of how much power consumers have is look what happened when consumers really curtailed their driving in 2020, right? What happened to gas prices? They plummeted. In some cases, under $1 a gallon. I filled up in Wisconsin for 99 cents in April of 2020. And that happened because American consumers drove less. Now, you don't have to drive less to use less. You can drive more efficiently to consume less in the same process. Things like instead of racing light to light, like I see so many Americans do, or go 85 down the interstate, you could do 65. You could do a little slower than normal. I tried it myself, and my average fuel efficiency went from about 27 miles a gallon up to 35 miles a gallon. So if every American could have the same level of patience, I know it's very difficult, but if we all just drove a little bit more fuel efficiently, or even if half of us drove a little bit more fuel efficiently, we could lower demand enough that it would make an impact on prices.
So really, it's about curtailing that demand to bring prices down.
It's one of two things to bring prices down. Either supply has to go up or demand has to go down. Now, if we can do both of those things, that's when you have a real COVID, right? Because supply went up and demand went down. So if you can do two of those things, then you'll see prices crater like they did during COVID. But right now, we can't do much with supply. We're kind of at a limit there. So the only other thing we can do is reduce demand. And so we won't get as much of a drop in price. And it depends on the degree of how much we can reduce demand. And like I said, if you drive more efficiently, you can basically reduce how often you're filling up. You could stretch your fill up from 7 days that your tank might last to 10 days. So if everyone did that, I estimate that gas prices could fall maybe 10 to 20%.
Wow, that's a pretty big hit. You're talking about demand and long-term effects. What about the impact of the shift to electric vehicles? Is that making producers more hesitant to invest or bring more facilities online?
Absolutely. Especially when the president is, through his policy and budget, he's encouraging and incentivizing EV production. Now, when the president picks winners and losers like that, it sends a clear signal to oil companies that their time is ticking. When the president says, I'm going to, do things like end fossil fuels and we're going to go to EVs, the writing's on the wall now. And oil companies get cold feet. They don't want to invest tens of billions of dollars raising production in the interim, because is that really money well spent if in 10 years the president envisions half of the nation's new cars being electric vehicles? It probably doesn't. So when the president says things like that, it does send a signal that would likely keep prices from falling and oil companies from fully investing in the future. So, now when it comes to the actual shift itself, I don't see it really affecting prices much yet. I think there's probably like 1 million electric vehicles, probably maybe more than that, maybe 2 million electric vehicles on the road today. We're not seeing a major hit to gasoline consumption yet. Gasoline demand is still rather strong. It may have actually peaked in 2019 now ahead of COVID. Part of the reason for that may be because a lot more jobs you can work remotely. But EVs, when it comes to consumption, I'm sure it will make more of a difference over time, but we're just starting to get that locomotive going in terms of there's probably some small difference in consumption because of EVs, but it's not significant enough because not enough of the American population is using EVs regularly.
Now, let's get a little bit local with some things. Michigan is a state that historically, at least in my perception, seems to have higher gas prices than other places. So I recently went to Memphis. Gas was much closer to $3 a gallon down there, whereas we're recording this, it's north of $4 at many stations here in Metro Detroit. But on the other hand, too, like I've been to Chicago and prices are higher in downtown Chicago than they are in Michigan. Why is Michigan a little bit higher than some areas and then lower than some others?
There's a lot of uniqueness. There's a lot of regionality to gas prices. So when you look state to state without looking region to region, a lot of the difference state to state is what the gasoline taxes may be. But right now in Michigan, there is some regionality to what prices are. The West Coast, the Northeast, there are different price trends. And as I described, Michigan prices just jumped in the last week because of some refinery issues that are kind of putting a caveat on our prices. And that's Tennessee, you're getting out of our region and where the supply and demand balance is different. It's better. Prices are lower there because you didn't have refinery issues in Tennessee and the area that supplies Tennessee, whereas you go into the Great Lakes and prices have been higher. So not only can state gasoline taxes in Michigan, which, as you point out, are higher than the national average, make a difference, but Michigan is supplied by different refineries than Tennessee, and what's happening at those refineries can have an impact. So, as I mentioned, Michigan's refineries struggling a little bit, whereas refineries in the Gulf Coast that supply Tennessee are generally not. You can see that spread narrow. If you were to compare Michigan and Tennessee over time, it's usually consistent. Right now, the difference is much wider because Michigan's, the Great Lakes refineries are having an issue and Tennessee's are not.
And when do you think those issues might be resolved?
Like I mentioned, the wholesale price of gasoline has come down significantly. As I look at the data today, it's down again. So it's just time. The numbers are looking very good that Michigan will and Detroit will fall well back below the $4 a gallon mark. So if you're listening and if you're on E, just buy a couple gallons. Don't buy a full tank yet because prices will be actively declining probably for the next couple of weeks, barring any new outages.
Yeah. And what do you see through the holiday season? Because I know a lot of people are going to be, this is a state where everybody drives everywhere, like this is the Motor City. What do you see for holiday prices?
It's been a little bit of an unpredictable year. So let me preface it by saying that, issues can happen, imbalances can change, but I'm hopeful that as we head into the holidays and the last, 6 weeks of the year, prices would be falling and lower than they've been in a while. We did see prices go fairly low in August, just before some of the refinery issues surfaced. But I think the lowest prices, that is, since Russia's invasion, will be coming in the next 6 weeks. So let's hope that we can end the year on a good note. I'm hopeful that, starting in the next couple of weeks, prices will get back below the $4 a gallon mark and hopefully stay there through the rest of the year. But again, like I said, caveat is that I don't know the future. So things could change, but that's what I'm hoping for. Low to mid $3 by the end of the year. And prices should be falling into Thanksgiving and maybe beyond that.
I think a lot of people will like to hear that news. Patrick Haan, head of petroleum analysis for GasBuddy, I do appreciate your time today on Daily Detroit.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Here are a few stories you should know around Metro Detroit. A lawsuit filed a couple of weeks ago by Republican Secretary of State candidate Christina Caramo was dismissed on Monday. It aimed to stop absentee ballots from being counted in the city of Detroit, among other things. The Wayne County Court judge did so because it did not have, quote, any shred of evidence, unquote. If you would like to see a judge come down hard on somebody who made a complaint, go ahead and read those 26 pages of opinion. It's interesting. A new contract with police officers was agreed upon in September, but Detroit City Council has not approved it. Cities from the suburbs and around the country are recruiting DPD officers, and officers are taking the positions because of the far better pay. About $10,000 to $13,000 per person per year is in question. Nearly 2,000 officers have left the department after being trained on the city's dime since 2014. And then some new things. New Order Coffee is returning with a cafe, but this time in St. Clair Shores on the Nautical Mile. New Order had a spot slinging breakfast cereal lattes on Woodward in Detroit. They have had an ongoing coffee roasting business. And then finally, Detroit City FC is changing ticket providers. They're throwing in with a number of teams in their league and switching from locally based Passage to SeatGeek. SeatGeek just raised $238 million in new investment after ditching plans to go public. All right, we are done for today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you went out and voted. As always, if you've got feedback, dailydetroit@gmail.com. With that, I'm Jer Stays. Remember that you are somebody, and I'll see you around Detroit.